It was a technological marvel, the likes of which the world had never seen. It was a true first of its kind, being the only jet capable of taking off and landing vertically without any need for a runway. That versatility was beloved. No longer did a pilot need several hundred feet of runway to take to the skies. They could head straight up and shoot off. And when it came time to land, practically any flat surface large enough to accommodate the jet was fair game. Which jet was this? The British-made Harrier jump jet, which was so amazing that even the United States incorporated it into the US Marine Corps. But if the Harrier was so special, why did it never get a successor? Why did the Harrier fade off into the sunset rather than getting a redesign that would allow it to stand tall over the new generations of vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL jets, that it inspired? We answer those questions and more in this video. But first we need to head to the Second World War, which is when the first studies into VTOL aircraft began. German engineers hypothesized the existence of an aircraft that could take off from a standing position, but their work never moved past the initial paper stages. After all, Germany was in the throes of a war that involved the entire world, and by the time the VTOL idea came along, it was losing that war. Still, those early plans at least suggested a VTOL aircraft would be possible. But possible doesn't mean simple. In the aftermath of World War II, NATO strategists got their heads together and decided that the need for large runways made the existing crop of fighter jets extremely vulnerable to both conventional and nuclear attacks. A VTOL jet was needed, akin to the one the Nazis had proposed, with several NATO-aligned countries dedicating much of the 1950s to experimenting with various VTOL systems to bring the paper dream into reality. Most of these experiments failed, at least in the sense that they didn't produce a combat-ready fighter jet, but that doesn't mean advancements weren't made. The French engineer René Leduc, who was already well regarded in aviation circles, was one of many who set his mind to work. He was famous for the creation of the pulse jet, which was an engine that used a system of flaps and valves to control how air was admitted into and expelled from the jet engine. That design would later go on to be used in the Fieseler Fi-103 flying bomb, which those fighting in World War II would later dub the Doodlebug. From there, Leduc worked on a host of new prototypes. The Leduc 010 introduced his ramjet engine. An interesting curio, this engine wouldn't work unless another aircraft lifted the one containing the ramjet into the skies, allowing it to glide long enough for it to pick up the speed needed to ignite the ramjet. The Leduc 010 never saw action. It was never intended to, as it was an experimental aircraft designed so Leduc could test his theories. Later designs would see the ramjet serve as part of a more functional aircraft, with the engine being finally combined with others to achieve the ability to allow it to take off and land under its own power in the 1940s. All of Leduc's work culminated in the creation of the Leduc 022. This final aircraft was intended to be capable of taking off from a grass runway, less than 0.62 miles long, and saw the introduction of Leduc's turbojet engine. On its 34th flight, the Leduc 022 engaged its turbojet engine to take off, then used its ramjets while in the sky to reach Mach 1.15, only to be damaged irreparably upon takeoff soon after. Leduc hadn't created a VTOL plane, but some of his ideas would go on to inspire engineers in Britain. Over in the UK, Rolls-Royce started working specifically to create a VTOL aircraft. It dubbed the first prototype the Thrust Measuring Rig, or TMR, a name chosen to hide the true nature of its work. The first of these rigs was tested in 1953, though it barely looked like a plane. It was simply a frame with 4 legs, though it gave Rolls-Royce a chance to test a pair of centrifugal flow turbojet engines that weren't a far cry away from those used in the Leduc 022. Arranged exhaust to exhaust, with both exhaust pointing downward, the first TMR weighed 7,500 pounds and could carry enough fuel for 10 minutes of flight. Not exactly enough for extended flight, but the TMR could hover. Flying Rolls-Royce's new prototype was a terrifying experience. The pilot was perched on a bedstead at the top of the rig, from which they controlled the TMR as it hovered while being tethered to the ground. Eventually, Rolls-Royce started running untethered tests, and it was these that proved the TMR was too dangerous. Though it had a successful untethered flight in 1954, it was eventually retired after a crash killed its pilot. A second TMR followed, only for that to also crash and kill a pilot within a week of untethered testing beginning. Still, the UK had a proof of concept based around a new type of engine named the lift jet. As hypothesized by Dr. Alan A. Griffiths in the 1940s, the lift jet weighed 269 pounds and could generate 2,030 pounds of thrust. Not much, but it was enough to push the TMR straight upward. After the TMR experiments proved to be something of a success, the UK awarded a contract to the Irish company Short Brothers to create two machines using this emerging VTOL technology, which Rolls-Royce had named the RB108. The first of these machines was the SC-1, which was a delta-winged aircraft with a tricycle landing gear and a funny little bubble nose. It may have looked like a large toy, but it packed 4 RB108s mounted vertically inside its fuselage, along with another mounted horizontally in the tail to allow for forward movement. The second variation of the SC-1 validated many of the early VTOL concepts, being capable of hovering upward and flying forward, but it had no operational capabilities. Think of it as the aircraft that confirmed the foundational concepts that would later go on to form the Harrier jump jet, and you'll see why it's so important. The UK had made another big step toward VTOL flight. As all of this was happening, French engineer Michel Wiebolt was working on a VTOL aircraft he called the Gyropter. Attempts to get funding from the US and French air forces ended in failure for Wiebolt, so he headed to the NATO-created Mutual Weapons Development Program, where his designs caught the attention of the US Air Force Colonel John Driscoll. The colonel passed Wiebolt's designs onto Bristol Aero Engines technical director Sir Stanley Hooker, who took a liking to the functional, albeit clumsy, design. Hooker assigned a small team, including a man named Gordon Lewis, to refine Wiebolt's designs, in addition to hiring Wiebolt as a consultant at Bristol. Their work resulted in the BE-53 engine, which got rid of the gyroscopic effects previously present in Wiebolt's design, and the UK had yet another working VTOL engine. It's the B-53 that would prove to be the game-changer that led to the development of the Harrier. Bristol's work eventually came to the attention of Sir Sidney Cam, who was the chief designer at Hawker Aircraft and was the mastermind behind Britain's Hunter and Tempest aircraft. Cam happened to mention that he was unimpressed with the various lift-engine VTOL designs he'd seen, such as those used in the SC-1, to a colleague named Jerry Morrell. That conversation led to Cam learning of Bristol's work, and identifying an opportunity to reinvigorate his flagging company, he got in touch with Hooker and Lewis. "When the devil are you coming to see me?" Cam asked Hooker. When the latter asked why he would need to come to see Cam, Hawker's head told him that he had an aircraft ready and waiting for Bristol's B-53 engine. Hooker took Lewis to inspect this aircraft, which Hawker dubbed the P-1121 Strike Fighter, and they were impressed by what they saw. Then Cam showcased the P-1127, a variation of the P-1121, which featured a B-53 engine, which was placed under the fuselage, had straight wings and a canopy that could seat 3 people. Later refinements brought that down to 2, but the important thing here was that the P-1127 actually looked like an aircraft that was appropriate for combat. There was just one problem. The British government wasn't particularly interested in the P-1127, or any VTOL aircraft for that matter. That left Hawker to fund the development of the aircraft itself. Work began, with Hawker cooperating with the Bristol engineers to create the Pegasus engine, capable of producing 9,000 pounds of thrust. That engine was soon tweaked, pushing the thrust levels up to 11,000 pounds after about a year of work. By 1960, Hawker was working on creating the first P-1127 with its new Pegasus engine. In October of that year, the P-1127 achieved its first hover, though its engine still wasn't powerful enough. The 1960s would see Hawker work on refining both its engine and aircraft frame. The Kestrel followed the P-1127, though it wasn't a combat-ready aircraft yet. However, Hawker had worked through the kinks and now had a plane that was fully capable of VTOL flight. In 1965, the UK Royal Air Force, or RAF, came calling for an evaluation. Impressed by what it saw, the RAF ordered an upgraded version of the Kestrel. Initially named the P-1127 RAF, this upgraded Kestrel's first flight took place on August 31, 1966, with the now combat-ready jet proving impressive enough for the RAF to order 60 of them. A year later, the P-1127 RAF was renamed. The Harrier was born. Decades of tinkering involving some of the greatest aviation minds in France and the UK had finally led to the world's first VTOL fighter jet. And it wouldn't be long until the US came calling. It had experienced its own trials and tribulations in trying to create a functioning VTOL aircraft. Ultimately, America had failed, so the late 1960s saw the British and American governments negotiating the possibility of having Harriers built in the US. Those negotiations were successful, with an aerospace manufacturing company named McDonnell Douglas, which is now owned by Boeing, teaming up with Hawker in 1969 to get the US ready to start production on its own Harriers. The Harrier's glory years would follow. In the 1970s, the United States officially bought the license to build Harriers. Dubbing the jet the AV-8A, this version of the Harrier would be one of the first to see combat action and was used by the RAF, US Marine Corps, and several other NATO-aligned air forces. A decade later, a variant of the AV-8A, named the British Aerospace Sea Harrier, was created to add air defense and naval striking capabilities to the aircraft. The jet would reach its peak in the mid-1980s, when McDonnell Douglas created the second-generation AV-8B Harrier. After a long and turbulent road, the Harrier proved itself time and again as a combat force. This second generation of the Harrier was an impressive specimen. It offered multiple functions, being as adept at close air support as it was in attack missions or serving as an intermediate-range intercept fighter. The jet featured a Rolls-Royce-built Pegasus turbofan engine that generated about 20,280 pounds of thrust. Depending on the variant, several were made for both the first and second generation of Harriers, the jets would be crewed by 1 or 2 people and was capable of reaching a top speed of over 730 miles per hour with a range of about 2,000 miles. While fast, it's notable that the Harrier wasn't faster than the speed of sound, which is an issue we'll discuss when we get into the reasons for why another Harrier wasn't made. As for armaments, these could vary depending on the version of the Harrier being flown. Typically, a Harrier had 7 wing stations. It could carry a pair of 30mm Aiden guns, 2 Sidewinder AIM-9L AAM missiles, ASRAMs, 4 Maverick air-to-ground missiles, and Paveway 2 and 3 laser-guided bombs, though not all at the same time. The loadout could also incorporate up to 16 Mark 82 bombs, or 6 Mark 83s. Later variants were even capable of carrying a pair of Storm Shadow missiles, which Ukraine war trackers may recognize as one of the long-range missiles that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants to be able to fire at Russia. The Harrier would go on to see multiple combat operations, including deployment in Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. However, it was during the Falklands War that the jet became legendary. By 1982, when the UK was assembling its task force to deal with the Falklands problem, the Harrier had been tweaked multiple times. The Sea Harrier was operational and in use by the Royal Navy. As for the standard Harriers built during the 1970s, the UK had converted most of their stock into the GR3 variant, which had stronger attack sensors and a more powerful engine than the GR1. When the Falklands War broke out, the Royal Navy only had 28 Sea Harriers, capable of taking off from its 2 aircraft carriers. That wouldn't be enough, leading the UK to convert several of its GR3s for use in the Falklands. All of those Harriers were later deployed in the Falklands. They had 2 goals: take out Argentinian aircraft out in the open and prevent the enemy from using Stanley Airfield on the Falkland Islands themselves. But it soon became clear that the Harriers were more versatile than these goals suggested. Beyond taking out airfields and destroying enemy craft, they also ran bombing runs on military sites and storage facilities, gradually whittling away Argentina's ability to use the Falklands for military purposes. By the end of the conflict, the UK only lost 4 of its 14 converted GR3s, with most of these being shot down by anti-aircraft guns. None were lost to surface-to-air missiles, to which Argentina had access during the war. The Harrier ended up being vital to the UK's efforts to reclaim the Falklands. When a ceasefire was declared on June 14, 1982, the UK built a full site at Port Stanley to house the GR3 detachment of Harriers that had proven so vital in its defence of the islands. There, the Harriers stayed to work in an air defense role for the next couple of decades. So what have we learned so far? The Harrier was the culmination of decades of research into VTOL flight and stands as one of the most innovative jets ever built. It was also effective. Its use in the Falklands conflict demonstrates that, as does its later use in Iraq, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. By every account, it was a spectacular aircraft, which brings us to the big question we need to answer: why didn't the UK ever make a successor? There are several reasons, starting with the fact that the Harrier started showing its age as we headed into the 1990s. We mentioned earlier that the jet wasn't capable of achieving supersonic speeds. That wasn't too much of a problem in the 1970s, but by the time the 80s rolled around, the Cold War had intensified to the point where both US and Russia had jets fast enough to easily break the speed of sound. The Soviet Union's MiG-29, for example, entered operation during the early 1980s and was capable of reaching a maximum speed of Mach 2.25. The Harrier could be left in the dust by this new generation of aircraft. Even with its VTOL capabilities, it simply wasn't fast enough to compete. Speed had to be sacrificed for the Harrier's engine. Speaking of sacrifice, the Harrier also couldn't carry as much weaponry or fuel as the emerging new generation of fighters. Again, these were necessary trade-offs to accommodate the jet's Pegasus engines. In short, questions were being raised about the Harrier's future utility. It was far from obsolete. The fact that it was used during several conflicts in the 1990s demonstrates this. But it was clear a new version was needed to build upon the Harrier's VTOL capabilities, while delivering the speed and weapon capacity needed in a new fighter jet. Russia recognized this. It had tried to develop its own VTOL aircraft several times, both before and after the Harrier took to the skies. With the Yak-38, it finally succeeded. The plane had its first flight in 1971, going on to be introduced into the Soviet Navy 5 years later. It wasn't as fast and couldn't match the range of the Harrier, but the Yak-38 showed that the Soviets were quickly catching up to their Western enemies on the technological front. More signs of these technological improvements came in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union decided to upgrade its stock of Yak-38s so they could become capable of flying at Mach speeds. The Yak-141 was the result, with the jet using rotating nozzle technology to hit speeds of Mach 1.7. That jet never went into full production, as its manufacturer, Yakovlev, ran out of money as the Soviet Union collapsed around it. But the Yak-141 was yet another signal to the West that technology was advancing beyond the Harrier's capabilities. Still, none of this explains why Britain didn't start building its own new Harrier. What stopped it? There are two answers. The UK didn't want or need to create a new version of the Harrier. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Yakovlev didn't go down with it. The company survived, and thanks to Russia becoming more open to the West now that it was no longer locked into an isolationist regime, it started to negotiate with several potential foreign partners using the Yak-141 as leverage. Lockheed Martin took an interest. By the early 1990s, it was about to begin work on developing what would become the F-35. The manufacturer struck a deal with Yakovlev, giving it $400 million in return for a trio of new VTOL prototypes and a new static test aircraft. It was essentially a paid technology transfer. Yakovlev received enough money to survive, and Lockheed Martin gained access to tech that it could use in a brand new program, the Joint Strike Fighter, or JSF program. The JSF is a design and development initiative enacted by the US Department of Defense, or DoD, to create a fifth-generation fighter jet that could replace several the US had out in the field. The British Harrier was among those requiring replacement, as was the F-16, the British Tornado fighter jet, and the F-18. The JSF program saw Boeing and Lockheed Martin compete with one another to design the new aircraft, with the latter ultimately winning out thanks to its X-35 design. The X-35 would eventually become the F-35. As for Britain, it had no interest in trying to compete with the US to design a fifth-generation fighter jet. The cost alone would be far beyond what the country's military was willing to spend. The JSF program is anticipated to cost the US upwards of $2 trillion over its entire lifespan. For the UK, which will only spend $54 billion on its military between 2024 and 2025, and would have been spending far less during the 1990s and 2000s, that massive cost was unacceptable. It would have to spend its current annual military budget 37 times over to match the JSF program, and that would also mean no funding going to any other aspect of its military. Unable to match the monetary muscle of the United States, the UK did the next best thing. It became a partner in the JSF program. Rather than try to develop its own replacement for the Harrier and Tornado jets, the UK would buy aircraft the US developed. Worse yet for the Harrier, its design wasn't suitable for what the US had in mind. America wanted to create a VTOL aircraft that could reach or exceed supersonic speeds while also being capable of stealth. The Pegasus engine that served the Harrier so well simply wasn't up to the task. Its distinctive whistle would prevent it from being used in a stealth aircraft. Plus, it wasn't capable of the speeds the US needed, and the nozzles it used to generate thrust were never going to work in America's fifth-generation fighter. If that wasn't enough to eliminate British designers from the running, BFBS Creative notes that Lockheed Martin had already patented a great solution to the Pegasus engine's problems several years before it started working on the JSF program. For a decade, the company's engineering team had been working on a new solution. They came up with the idea of placing a lift fan inside the fuselage, in the same place where Yakovlev had placed a pair of lift jets. A shaft placed on the engine would also drive through the fuselage and to the lift fan. The UK took note of this brilliant innovation, which was as much of a step forward as those that had allowed it to turn VTOL concepts into combat realities with the Harrier. Seeing that Lockheed Martin's patent was not only workable, but a stroke of genius, the UK gave up on designing an alternative. It didn't need to. One of its biggest allies had already found a solution that would solve many of the Harrier's problems, so why bother working on another one? The result of this, along with several other innovations, gave the world the F-35. Lockheed Martin's fifth-generation fighter blows the Harrier out of the water in almost every respect. It's a little larger at 50.4 feet compared to the Harrier's 46.3 foot length. It also has a wider wingspan and is closer to 6 feet higher, but its engine is more than powerful enough to account for that extra size and the weight that comes along with it. The F-35 has the Pratt & Whitney F135 F119 PW100 turbofan engine, which delivers 28,000 pounds of dry thrust, compared to the Pegasus engine, which only managed 23,500 pounds of horizontal thrust. Reheat the Pratt & Whitney engine, and its thrust numbers go through the roof, topping out at 43,000 pounds. This powerful engine allows the F-35 to hit a top speed of 1,199 miles per hour, easily breaking the sound barrier and making it almost twice as fast as the Harrier. All of that comes in a jet that has slightly longer range, 1,379 miles to the Harrier's 1,367 miles, and it can hit the same 50,000-foot ceiling as the legendary British jet. Is it any wonder the British didn't bother to compete? Add a slew of onboard computational innovations that make the F-35 easier to fly than the Harrier, and Britain's decision to switch to building frames for the F-35 makes even more sense. They already have access to a plane that exceeds the Harrier in every major metric. The very existence of the JSF program is enough for the UK to have not built a single new fighter for over 3 decades. It hasn't made a new one since the introduction of the Sea Harrier in the 1980s because the F-35 served every need it had in terms of replacing the Harrier. Despite never receiving an official British replacement, the Harrier's legacy is more than secured. It was the first truly combat-functional VTOL aircraft, and it set the standard for what these types of planes could be for decades. The US used it when it failed to create a VTOL aircraft of its own. The Soviet Union tried to copy it, only to end up with a plane that paled in comparison. Even when the Soviets did manage to develop a VTOL fighter that exceeded the Harrier's capabilities, the collapse of the Soviet Union quickly led to those innovations being rolled into the F-35. In many ways, the Harrier walked so the F-35 could run. Its legacy will be one of innovation and the will to succeed at a feat of engineering that many thought impossible. You may never see a new version of the Harrier come out of the UK, but you'll see the influence it had on the aviation world every time you see an F-35 or any other VTOL aircraft. But what do you think about the Harrier? Where does it stand among other British military innovations? Could the jet still find a use in modern combat? And will Britain finally reclaim its crown as one of the leaders in military innovation with the Team Tempest project that may see it develop its first fighter jet in over 30 years? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Can the United Kingdom Survive a Nuclear War? Or click this other video instead.